Hello and welcome to the second OutsourceXtra webinar. I'm Outsource Magazine editor Jamie Liddell, and also in our studio today once again is Al Tepper, Outsource's publisher. Those of you who joined us for last week's launch will be aware that pretty much anything could be happening in the next 20 minutes or so. For those of you who weren't here last week, we want this to be a really interactive event, so please do feel free to send in any thoughts you might have on what we're discussing or anything else via the chat or question function on your webinar interface. In a minute, I'm going to introduce our guest interviewee for today. And again, please do send in any questions or thoughts you might have to him. I'm very sure he's going to relish being put on the spot like that. But first, I wanted to give a bit of a follow-up from last week's OutsourceXtra, and specifically the comments I made on what I see as the need for potentially greater discussion within the community about the ethical framework in and around outsourcing. Very briefly, for those who didn't attend last week, I spoke about how I think a significant debate around the ethics of outsourcing and offshoring specifically is taking place outside what we commonly consider to be the outsourcing space, but that this debate isn't visible to anywhere near the same degree actually within and amongst the outsourcing community itself. And I think that this is both unhelpful and potentially damaging. It's obvious from the feedback to a positive story about the global socioeconomic benefits of outsourcing that was written recently by one of my columnists that at least one side of the ethical debate is indeed being considered. But are we too scared perhaps to address the less positive or the less comfortable ethical implications of what we do? So this week, following last week's OutsourceXtra, I received a few emails on this topic, and first plug for this, incidentally, you can write to me, as always, at jamie.liddell@outsourcemagazine.co.uk. I thought I'd share a couple of those with you this afternoon, because I thought this might be an interesting way to expand and lead into that debate, and I'll come on to that in a bit. I thought this musing in particular was quite interesting. I've been working in and around IT outsourcing for well over a decade, and in that time the whole frame of reference has changed. It's become so embedded in corporate strategy that to talk about the morality of outsourcing is the same as talking about the morality of business. Businesses do not exist for the benefit of their employees. It is shareholders first, customers second, employees wherever the corporation views them to be. This isn't a morally bad thing or a good thing. It is just how it is. When legislative steps are taken to protect employees to the detriment of the bottom line, stakeholders call this unnecessary regulation and lobby very hard against it. But without state interference, and even sometimes despite of it, corporations have a history of doing what we might call immoral things for the benefit of the bottom line. But then so do governments themselves, and so do we as individuals. It's human nature. It's all about the checks and balances that we put on it. Business will do what's right for business, and it's up to society through government to work out where those checks and balances need to be. So I thought that was a particularly interesting input. Here's a similar, perhaps more confrontational email from someone else, or a section from that email. This is a non-argument. Business is Darwinian, and we don't talk about evolution in ethical terms. If society sees business as unethical, it must elect leaders who are prepared to enact laws reining it in. That it hasn't done so indicates that society doesn't see this as a problem, and therefore nor should we. Which is a, is a standpoint that you can pretty much take across the board. So whether or not that's right, I don't know. It's not a question of right or wrong, I guess. It's a question of interpretation. How do you feel about that? So let us know via the chat function, or again by email at jamie.liddell@outsourcemagazine.co.uk. I think I'm going to be putting something together on this for a future issue of the magazine. It's too short notice to do that for the spring issue, which we will be discussing a little bit later on as well. Before we do that, however, it's time to speak to this week's guest. Hopefully we have Justin Mullen on the line. Justin, are you with us? Justin?
Hi, Jamie. I'm here.
Marvellous. I thought we were going to have another one of last week's catastrophes there. Justin, welcome.
Thanks very much.
Those of you who don't know, Justin Mullen is the Director of Managed Service Solutions. He's focused on building businesses in new or emerging market areas where a variety of skills are required, from technical knowledge through sales and marketing, product creation and definition, contract negotiation, project management, financial management, and project or corporate financing. His expertise is focused in the information management sector, largely the areas of workflow and process management, and more recently cloud-based solutions to hold, manage, and report upon the work and information generated by an organization. And he's definitely looking forward to taking some of your questions and thoughts via the chat function. Justin, I'm going to be asking a few questions, and Al's going to chime in, so be prepared to take from us and also from the audience as and when. But let's kick off. Can you just tell us, obviously you're working in and around a lot of organisations and have a really good perspective, right down the scope tree, if you like. What are some of the most prominent trends you're seeing in the space right now?
Sure, Jamie. Well, thanks for that, and thanks for that lovely long introduction. You set me up very well. But I guess it's maybe not trends, Jamie. It's more just some observations that I'm seeing. I suppose some of the things that are obvious, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be seeing, is nothing slowing down in the outsourcing industry. And regardless of the last comment around the ethics of outsourcing, it's not slowing down the fact that more and more contracts are being signed every day. We see this, the outsourcing space is growing. There's a lot of the historical contracts, government contracts through Francis Maud that are being split up. There's lots of large clients that are taking some of their big historical contracts with the big IBMs and they're splitting them up. So there's more and more contracts coming all of the time. And with obviously a growth of a lot of the data center and virtualization and big data stuff, there's new types of outsourcing contracts. So I guess I'm seeing a lot of growth, and some of that growth is underpinned by, I guess, some of the growth in the big outsourcing companies. Even Capgemini announced some of their growth figures this week. They're up about 1% or 0.9%. Atos announced big growth, 7.5% this year, and some of the BPO providers are growing all of the time. Capita growing and everyone else. So as much as those legacy areas are growing, we're also seeing a lot of growth in the LPO. I know you had Andrew Burgess on last week, but legal process outsourcing, insurance outsourcing, fleet management, and even if you look at what we do, which is outsourcing the company's governance and management information, all of these things are growing, and so there's just more and more contracts all of the time. So that's the first thing. So nothing's slowing down despite this economy. I guess another observation I would have is, even after decades of outsourcing and shared services, everyone is continuing to manage and govern these big relationships and these big service delivery challenges with Excel and PowerPoint. Now, I find it frankly amazing. I go into a lot of organizations. We're absolutely inundated with this stuff. There's a massive cottage industry in our businesses that's churning out management information and governance information on Excel and splitting it into PowerPoint and driving lots of businesses based on those two core areas. And the reason why is because it's easy. It's easy for them to use it. It's easy for them to build the management information decks. But the problem is it's just not working, and it's still not enabling people to focus on the right things. So that's the second sort of observation, and I guess just two more. The third one, which is the one I always smile about, is everything's green, but I'm not happy. So we see a lot of the big relationships where even if you've managed to get on top of it and got your data integrated and you're not using Excel, they often find they're measuring the wrong things. And a good friend of ours, Jamie, Deborah Kopp's Sourcing Change, she wrote a great article on this. If my dashboard is so green, why am I so unhappy, or something like that. And I think it's brilliant, but it just goes to the heart of the fact that we're probably still measuring the things we can measure rather than the things that we want to measure across the business. So we need to go back into perhaps some sort of a definition or defining the right things to measure. But that does bring contractual sort of outcomes as a result of that, i.e. renegotiation. I suppose the final observation, which is probably no surprise to anyone listening, is data. Big data is everywhere. I know you've commented on it a few times, and no one quite knows what it means for them. For some it's a storage problem, for some it's an analytical problem. But it's becoming more prevalent. Even the newspapers are talking about a telegraph at something, and that. Some do know about it and what to do with it. You had a good column this week, I think. Big data in the utility sector that was that if no one has read, they should read. It's pretty good. I think for me regarding data, while I think big data is important, for sentiment analysis and behavioral analysis and things like that, I think the bigger problem and a more current problem is the fact that the data that people have, it's disconnected, and they can't join it up to be able to know what's going on within their own organizations. And I guess they're crying out for it to really get some real insights in terms of how services are being delivered, whether they're achieving some of those goals. And I guess their management teams just can't understand why they can't do it. So those for me would be the observations, Jamie, that I'm seeing whenever I'm out there in the market.
Well, look, I mean, obviously there's a hell of a lot to discuss there, and I know time's pretty precious with you, Justin, so we don't want to take up too much. But just to go back to the first one of those to start off with, obviously I totally agree with you. There are more and more contracts being signed. It feels like there's a load of different snowballs rolling down the hill and really picking up pace. I'm wondering whether or not there's an interesting implication there, because obviously as more and more contracts come into play, obviously the contract management requirement and resource requirement accelerates as well, and there's a cost implication there. Do we feel that at some point there might be a question of losing the baby with the bathwater, if you like, in terms of the gains potentially being made, or at least a good tranche of the gains potentially being made from outsourcing and taking on a kind of very outsourcing-friendly philosophy? Do we feel that there's a danger that they might be lost in terms of the amount of time, the amount of effort, the amount of knowledge development that has to go into the contract management arm of things?
Well, yeah, I suppose there is, and I guess that whole area has been growing a hell of a lot over the last sort of 3 or 4 years. We were at the Gartner show last year. We sponsored it, and the big discussion that was going on at that show was vendor management and vendor governance. With all of these contracts being signed and commissioned, there's a hell of a lot of requirements and effort required in the retained team to then manage these contracts, and not just manage the performance and the SLAs and everything else, to manage the overall relationship with these organizations. And I guess you're right, there is a risk that some of that core knowledge is going to drop out. But I guess the school of thought that people should try to follow is to a certain extent outsource the body rather than outsource the brain. And so keep as much of the core sort of CTO skills, direction, strategy skills as you can in-house. And yes, build good contract management teams that sort of can govern those relationships. But and obviously take feeds in from those relationships. They should be part of your strategic direction or the design of your strategic direction. But yeah, I would hope that it's not going to happen. I genuinely would. I think organizations are getting a bit clever about that, and they are keeping a lot of that core direction and strategy in-house these days, I must admit.
Hi, Justin. I've got a couple of questions that I just want to throw your way. Questions or clarifications. The first one relating to the first trend, nothing slowing down. I mean, what we're talking about really is that the market's moving south into the mid-market. There's more deals in the mid-market, more deals in the SME space. If that's true, obviously we're about to see massive disruption, or are we already seeing it? Because the big major providers will struggle to move as quickly as these small outlying innovators. So are we entering a period of disruption? Are we in a period of disruption already? Or have we seen the best disruption yet to come?
I think we certainly are in a period of disruption, and certainly we're going to see more and more of the sort of the mid-tier players, the second and third-tier players. I see a lot of companies that started out as small consulting groups a couple of years ago that are now growing to 50, 100-man, 200-man outsourcing organizations, providing massive amounts of support for, small to medium businesses. And they're enabled to do that because they don't have to put in the investment in infrastructure that many of the big boys had to put in play in the past. They can take all of their services as cloud-based services. They can run their help desk. They can run their services, run the remote monitoring tools, often as cloud-based solutions. And in fact, part of their value proposition to a lot of these mid-tier players is we'll take you from where you are and we'll get rid of a lot of your internal infrastructure and we'll just stick you straight onto cloud-based stuff that's easy to manage, and then we'll provide a service wrap around it. So I'd say, yes, there is a big disruption going on, but that disruption's not affecting the growth figures of the big boys. As I mentioned to you earlier on, just look at Atos. They have 7.5% growth on last year. Capgemini are still growing despite the Aspire contracts, so they're dropping off. So, I think it is a disruption, but it's not so significant that it's affecting the growth of the big boys as well.
Okay, that's interesting. So that almost means that we're seeing the evolution of a real gap between the two tiers of the market. It's going to be harder and harder as those big boys continue to stretch away and continue their growth. Is it going to be harder for people to break in? Are we talking about the top four in the Premiership here? Is that how it's going to be?
Yeah, I think they'll always remain in the Premiership, but I don't think it's going to be tougher and tougher to break in. I think these contracts are getting broken up. The clients are getting clever. They're going for the tower-based approach in terms of their outsourcing. They're doing that because they want to rip and replace opportunity. So if one provider's not performing, they can pull them out and put it in. It does bring with it a lot of challenges around service integration and nothing falling in between the gaps. So of course those challenges remain. But I think as we move forward, the smaller providers have greater and greater opportunities to get in because they can be more nimble. They are predominantly cloud-based in terms of their delivery models, and they're picking up more and more point solutions, whether it be point on a specific service tower or whether it be a point solution in terms of a part or a regional division of a large organization.
Okay. I've just time for a question actually from the audience. Someone has asked specifically in relation to the points you made about data. Obviously what we're seeing is a bit of a cart before horse scenario developing where we all started collecting data, but nobody really knew what they were going to do with it, and now there's going to be the analytics of mining. But what lessons are we going to learn from big data so we don't put the cart before the horse the next time round? And what is going to, what's going to come next if it's going to be something that we're going to fall to the same hurdle on? If we can, do you have a sense of, I guess the question is asking, do you have a sense of, what's going to be the next trend, and how do we avoid putting the cart before the horse again?
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I agree totally that we're putting the cart before the horse. The big data element, there is a lot of hype about it, but really it's all around the storage of the data that's being spewed out of these vast, it's all about volume, velocity, and variety, I think, is the terms that they use. But there's a vast quantity of data that's coming out of Twitter and LinkedIn and web feeds and various other things, as well as, sort of core applications. And I think that there is a bit of, we're putting the storage in before we're putting the analytics. So we're putting in big Apache Hadoop systems and big sort of NoSQL databases and that. So to store it all, I think the challenge at the minute is the fact that while we may be storing it, we haven't yet quite worked out how to analyze and deal with the analytics that underpins that, to be able to do the sentiment analysis. What does, as a result of all of this data, what do my clients feel about me? Or the behavior analysis, in terms of how are my clients behaving in terms of their interactions with me. I think we haven't quite got all of that right, and that sort of leads a little bit to my point that it's less so much the fact that it's big data, it's actually joined up data, where we've connected it up and we've flattened the data out into data repositories, reporting data repositories that we're able to analyze and get real insights in terms of the area that we're interested in, whether it be customer behavior or whether it be, whatever else. So I think they have put the storage in first. I think the challenge is the analytics, and that's what we're going to see play out over this year and next year.
Cool.
Justin, I know you've got to dash off, so thank you very much for that really, really great insight. And I think it's probably best to point listeners to you directly. If you want to follow up on that with Justin and anyone, I'm sure he'll be delighted to hear from you. And you can write to him at justin.mullen, that's justin.mullen, at mssols.com. And thank you very much, Justin. That's great. So before we finish, just want to take a quick peek at what we've got coming up in our next issue, which is Outsource number 31, spring 2013. It comes out mid-March, and it's going to be another bumper extravaganza of a magazine, we hope. We're going to be looking at, or taking deep dives into, facilities management, supply chain outsourcing, and the UK healthcare outsourcing space, among much else. I'm still taking input on those topics. If there are any of you out there with thoughts you'd like to share, please do write to me at jamie.liddell@outsourcemagasine.co.uk. There's also a bit of a shared services flavour to this issue, thanks to two really great interviews we've got with prominent figures from that space. Regular Outsource columnist Nick Mellors went over to Chicago recently and met up with Paul Bartley, who's the Director, Program Support Center, US Department of Health and Human Services. Paul runs what is by any measure one of the most important structural components of the US government. His organisation serves, I believe, around 45 different government agencies and disperses almost $400 billion in grants each year. If you do want to hear from someone with a very, very big job indeed, you won't want to miss the next issue. We also hear via Loughborough University's Ian Herbert and Kathleen McLaughlin from Paul Wickens, who's the Chief Executive of NICS Enterprise Shared Services. an SSO established 3 years ago to serve the Northern Irish Civil Service. Specifically, Ian and Kathleen look at how the SSO was set up and what the challenges have been around branding and forging a coherent corporate identity. And I know that those are two absolutely crucial aspects of any shared services implementation. So anyone wanting any tips on that, how they've done that in Northern Ireland, then definitely don't miss the next issue. Elsewhere, we've got an article from last week's OutsourceXtra guest, Andrew Burgess, who's writing on the death of outsourcing, which is always a title guaranteed to get some good traction, I think. We hear from regular author and outsourcing superstar Kate Vitasek on some companies who've adopted her vested outsourcing methodology and why. Sanjay Chadha examines the rise of domestic or onshore outsourcing and the drivers behind it. We've got some more input from DLA Piper following the survey we ran in conjunction with them last year, and a whole host more, of course, including our usual regular features and some input from our partners at the NOA and Nelson Hall. If you're not yet a subscriber to the print issue, please do go to our homepage and click on the free subscription tab at the top of the page to apply. And also, please remember, once again, if you've got any feedback on the magazine or thoughts on future content, I'm really always delighted to discuss this. It's what makes us, or what helps us keep getting better and better. Please do drop me an email. That's it from us this week, so hopefully you've enjoyed this latest OutsourceXtra. Either way, of course, we'd love to get your feedback. If you've got any suggestions for future guests or anything else you'd like to get off your chest, you can send anything through to me at, once again, jamie.liddell@outsourcemagazine.co.uk. Very much look forward to hearing from you all. Meanwhile, have a great weekend, and we hope to see you again, if that's the right word, at the same time next week.